Welcome to a journey into the mind of the man who literally built the modern world. We are not just talking about wealth today. We are talking about power in its rawest, most terrifying form. John D. Rockefeller. You know the name. It's plastered on university buildings, foundations, and centers across America. But do you really know the man? Or do you only know the sanitized version that history books have allowed you to see? Imagine a wealth so vast that it makes Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk look like they're just getting started. Imagine a man who didn't just dominate a market, but extinguished the very concept of competition. A man who looked at the chaos of the world and decided that he, and he alone, had the divine right to bring order to it. This is not just a biography. This is a blueprint. This is an autopsy of the most efficient, ruthless, and brilliant money-making machine in human history. Over the next 6 parts, we're going to deconstruct the Rockefeller algorithm. We're going to strip away the myths and look at the mechanics. How did a boy born into poverty, the son of a con artist and a religious zealot, rise to control 90% of the most valuable resource on the planet? What was the psychological engine that drove him? And most importantly, what are the dark, uncomfortable lessons that you can extract from his life to understand how power truly operates in our world today? If you're looking for a simple success story, turn back now. But if you're ready to stare into the abyss of ambition, to understand the price of absolute control, and to see the dark truth behind the first billionaire, then stay with me. Because we are about to open the ledger of John D. Rockefeller. And the numbers are written in blood and oil. To understand the empire, you must first understand the architect. And to understand the architect, you have to look at the 2 opposing forces that forged his soul. On one side, we have William Avery Rockefeller. They called him Devil Bill, and the nickname was earned. He was a con man, a bigamist, a seller of snake oil who would wander into towns, charm the locals, cheat them out of their savings, and then vanish into the night. He was a man of zero morality but infinite cunning. He taught young John a lesson that would become the cornerstone of Standard Oil. He famously said, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp." Think about that for a second. Your own father, the man supposed to protect you, is actively plotting to deceive you, just to teach you that the world is a predator. This instilled in John a deep, paranoid hyper-awareness. He learned that trust is a liability. He learned that the only person you can rely on is yourself. And even then, you must be vigilant. Devil Bill gave Rockefeller his killer instinct. His ability to look a man in the eye, shake his hand, and simultaneously plan his destruction. On the other side was his mother, Eliza. She was the anchor, a deeply pious, strict, religious woman who held the family together while Devil Bill was out living his double life. She taught John the value of silence. She taught him discipline. She taught him that waste was a sin against God. From her, he learned the power of the ledger. She made him account for every single penny. These two forces, the ruthless predation of the father and the rigid, almost robotic discipline of the mother, crashed together inside the mind of young John. The result was a terrifying hybrid. He had the aggression of a con man, but the patience of a saint. He could wait years for a deal to mature. He could squeeze a competitor to death, not with anger, but with a calm, calculated precision, believing he was doing God's work by eliminating waste. At age 16, while other boys were thinking about adventure or romance, John D. Rockefeller fell in love. But not with a girl. He fell in love with a book. A ledger book. He got his first job as an assistant bookkeeper in Cleveland, Ohio. This wasn't just a job to him. It was a revelation. He later said that the ledger was his best friend. Why? Because in a ledger, there is no chaos. There is no uncertainty. Everything has a place. Inputs and outputs. Profits and losses. It's a closed system of perfect logic. For a boy who grew up in the chaotic, unpredictable shadow of Devil Bill, the ledger offered control. This is a critical psychological insight. Rockefeller's entire career was an attempt to impose the order of the ledger onto the messy, chaotic real world. He became obsessed with efficiency. He didn't care about the product as much as he cared about the process. He would stay up late at night, reviewing the numbers, looking for a fraction of a cent that could be saved. Most people look at business and see products or marketing. Rockefeller looked at business and saw inefficiencies to be corrected. He realized early on that wealth isn't just about how much you make. It's about how much you don't lose. This mindset, this microscopic attention to detail, would become his superpower. While his future competitors were out drinking or gambling, celebrating a good week, Rockefeller was in the office, analyzing the cost of barrels, the cost of transport, the cost of everything. He was building a mental database that would eventually allow him to suffocate the entire industry. Then came 1859. Titusville, Pennsylvania. Colonel Edwin Drake drilled a hole in the ground and black sludge shot into the sky. Oil. The world changed overnight. It was the start of the modern era. Suddenly, kerosene lamps could light up the night. The demand was instantaneous and insatiable. It was a gold rush. Thousands of people flooded into Pennsylvania. Farmers sold their land. Speculators bet their life savings. It was a frenzy of greed and hope. It was the Wild West. People were drilling wells everywhere, hoping to strike it rich. It was a lottery. Rockefeller went to Pennsylvania to see it for himself, but he didn't see opportunity in the drilling. He saw disaster. He saw chaos. He saw a market that was destined to crash. Why? Because drilling for oil is gambling. You spend money, you drill, and maybe you find oil, maybe you don't. And even if you do, if everyone else finds oil at the same time, the price collapses and you go broke. Rockefeller despised gambling. Remember Devil Bill. Rockefeller hated risk. He wanted certainty. He looked at the muddy fields of Titusville, the desperate men, the wasted oil spilling onto the ground, and he turned his back on it. He reportedly said, "I will not be a driller. I will not rely on luck." This is the moment that separated him from everyone else. This is the strategic genius at work. He realized that the money wasn't in the raw material. The money was in the bottleneck. The money was in the processing. The crude oil coming out of the ground was useless until it was refined into kerosene. So, while the world was going mad trying to find oil, Rockefeller went back to Cleveland and built a refinery. This was the masterstroke. He positioned himself at the choke point of the industry. It didn't matter who found the oil. It didn't matter which driller got lucky and which one went bust. Eventually, they all had to come to him. He treated refining like a science. He applied that fanatical discipline he learned from his mother. He hired chemists. He found ways to turn the waste products of refining, like tar and sludge, into profitable byproducts like paraffin wax and lubricants. His competitors were dumping this stuff in the river. Rockefeller was selling it. This lowered his production costs significantly below everyone else. He wasn't just competing. He was changing the economics of the game. He could sell his kerosene at a profit while his competitors were selling at a loss. He created a margin of safety that made him invincible. But efficiency was only the first step. Rockefeller looked at the refining industry in Cleveland and saw the same problem. He saw in the oil fields too many players. There were dozens of small refineries, all cutting prices, all fighting for scraps. It was messy. It was inefficient. It offended his sense of order. He decided that the market didn't need competition. It needed consolidation. It needed a ruler. He formed Standard Oil in 1870. The name was chosen carefully. Standard. He was promising a standard of quality and safety in a market where cheap, volatile kerosene was blowing up houses. But the name also implied something else. It implied that this would be the only standard. By the late 1860s, Rockefeller had a vision that was terrifying in its scope. He realized that to stabilize the industry, to guarantee his own profits, he had to eliminate the variable of other people. He couldn't just be the best player in the game. He had to own the board. He looked at his competitors not as rivals to be beaten, but as errors in the system to be corrected. He believed, truly believed, that he was doing them a favor by buying them out. He was saving them from their own incompetence. He was bringing order to chaos. This brings us to the precipice of the most controversial event in business history. Rockefeller had the efficiency. He had the capital. He had the mindset. Now, he needed a weapon. A weapon that would allow him to crush his rivals without firing a single shot. He turned his eyes to the railroads. The railroads were the arteries of the American economy. They moved the oil from the wells to the refineries, and from the refineries to the customers. Rockefeller realized that if he could control the transport, he could control the price. He could starve his enemies by cutting off their supply lines. He began to craft a secret alliance, a conspiracy so audacious, so unethical, and so brilliant that it would forever change the laws of the United States. He was about to launch a war, not a war of guns, but a war of rebates and logistics. A war that would leave Cleveland in ruins and give birth to the first true monopoly. In the next part, we'll dive into the Cleveland Massacre. We'll see exactly how Rockefeller used the railroads to hold a gun to the head of the entire oil industry. We'll deconstruct the brutal negotiations, the secret deals, and the cold-blooded tactics he used to turn 26 competitors into one giant empire in the span of just 3 months. The dark truth is just beginning to surface. Stay tuned. We left off in part 1 with Rockefeller staring at the map of the American economy, realizing that the railroads were the arteries of commerce. If he could pinch those arteries, he could stop the heart of any competitor. In 1871, he didn't just strike a deal. He orchestrated a conspiracy so unfair, so devastatingly effective, that it remains the gold standard for monopolistic tactics. It was called the South Improvement Company. Now, you might have heard of rebates. A rebate is a volume discount. You ship more. You pay less. That's standard business. Costco does it. Walmart does it. But Rockefeller wasn't interested in standard business. He invented something far more sinister. The drawback. Here is how the South Improvement Company scheme worked. It's breathtaking in its audacity. Rockefeller went to the 3 major railroads, the Pennsylvania, the Erie, and the New York Central. He told them, "I will give you all of my oil shipments. I will guarantee you steady, massive volume every single day. In exchange, you will give me a massive discount on shipping rates." That's the rebate part. But then came the kicker. He demanded that the railroads charge his competitors, the other 25 refineries in Cleveland, a much higher rate. And here is the genius, evil twist. Every time one of his competitors paid that high rate to ship a barrel of oil, the railroad had to take a portion of that money and give it to Rockefeller. Let that sink in. Rockefeller wasn't just paying less. He was getting paid every time his competitors tried to do business. If his rival shipped oil, Rockefeller made a profit. If his rival didn't ship oil, they went bankrupt, and Rockefeller bought them out. It was a mathematical checkmate. It was a rigged game where the house always wins, and Rockefeller owned the house. Why did the railroads agree to this? Because they were desperate. The railroads were in a brutal price war of their own. They were bleeding money. They needed guaranteed volume to survive. Rockefeller offered them salvation. He offered them a steady flow of oil that would fill their trains every day. He leveraged their desperation against them to forge a weapon against his own rivals. This is a masterclass in leverage. Finding a partner who is powerful but vulnerable, and offering them a lifeline that essentially enslaves them to your will. Armed with this secret weapon, the South Improvement Company contract, Rockefeller launched his offensive in February 1872. This event is known to history as the Cleveland Massacre. The word massacre implies violence, noise, and blood, but Rockefeller's massacre was silent. It was conducted in quiet offices, with polite words and firm handshakes. It was psychological warfare at its finest. He didn't start by destroying them. He started by offering them a choice. He would invite a competitor to his office. He would be calm, polite, almost gentle. He would open his books, his real, private ledger, and show them to the rival. He would show them exactly how low his costs were. He would demonstrate, with cold, hard numbers, that he could sell oil for less than it cost them to produce it. Then he would drop the hammer. He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't threaten. He would simply reveal the existence of the South Improvement Company deal. He would let them know that the railroads were in his pocket. He would say, in effect, the game is over. You just don't know it yet. You can't compete. If you try, you will lose everything. But I am a benevolent man. I will buy your refinery right now. I will pay you a fair price based on the value of your assets. And I will give you a choice. You can take cash. Or you can take Standard Oil stock. This was the ultimate psychological squeeze. He was offering them a lifeboat while simultaneously drilling a hole in their ship. He wasn't just defeating them. He was converting them. He wanted the best brains in the industry to work for him. Those who were smart enough to see the writing on the wall took the stock. They became incredibly rich as Standard Oil grew. Those who took the cash usually faded into obscurity. And those who refused to sell, they were crushed without mercy. The speed of the operation was terrifying. In less than 3 months, between February and April of 1872, John D. Rockefeller bought out 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland. Imagine an industry where there are dozens of thriving businesses. Then, 90 days later, there is only one. It was a consolidation of power that has no parallel in modern history. The sheer administrative capacity required to appraise, negotiate, and integrate 22 companies in 3 months is mind-boggling. Rockefeller worked himself to the bone. He was everywhere. He was the appraiser, the negotiator, the strategist. He had an uncanny ability to detach emotion from business. When a rival pleaded for mercy, appealing to their long friendship or their families, Rockefeller would listen politely and then repeat his offer. I am saving you. He would say, the industry is chaotic. It's ruining everyone. By consolidating, we are saving the oil business. He genuinely believed this. This is the Messiah complex of the monopolist. Rockefeller didn't see himself as a predator. He saw himself as a savior. He believed that competition was a form of waste, a sin against efficiency. In his mind, he was bringing order to a disorderly world. He was the angel of efficiency, wielding a flaming sword of monopoly. This self-righteousness made him unstoppable. A man who believes he is doing God's work will never hesitate, never doubt, and never back down. But secrets in business rarely stay secret forever. As the Cleveland refineries fell, one by one, word of the South Improvement Company leaked out. The independent oil producers in Pennsylvania, the drillers, were furious. They realized that this conspiracy wasn't just targeting the refiners. It was targeting them too. If Rockefeller controlled all the refining, he would dictate the price of crude oil. He would turn the drillers into serfs. A furious backlash erupted. It was known as the Oil War. The drillers organized. They boycotted Standard Oil. They refused to sell crude to Rockefeller's refineries. They attacked the railroads, tearing up tracks and threatening executives. The press got hold of the story. For the first time, the name Rockefeller began to appear in newspapers. Not as a businessman, but as a villain. A monster. An octopus. The public was outraged. The idea that a secret group of men could rig the entire economy, could control the price of light itself, was terrifying. Under immense pressure, the railroads backed down. The Pennsylvania legislature revoked the charter of the South Improvement Company. The scheme officially collapsed. Most historians look at this moment and say, Rockefeller lost. The scheme was exposed. The contract was canceled. He was publicly shamed. But Rockefeller didn't lose, because by the time the scheme was canceled, the damage was already done. He already owned 22 of the 26 refineries in Cleveland. He had used the threat of the weapon to conquer the city. Even though the gun was now empty, the victims were already dead or assimilated. He had used a phantom weapon to win a real war. With Cleveland under his thumb, Rockefeller didn't mourn the loss of the South Improvement Company. He simply pivoted. He realized that while secret deals were powerful, they were fragile politically. He needed a more permanent form of control. He turned his attention back to efficiency, but on a massive scale. Now that he controlled the refining capacity of an entire region, he had economies of scale that no one else could match. He built his own barrel factories, cutting the cost of a barrel from $2.50 to 96 cents. He bought his own forests to source the wood. He bought his own wagons. He integrated vertically. He created a machine so efficient that he could sell kerosene at a profit for a price that would bankrupt anyone else. He effectively weaponized efficiency. He would go into a new market, say Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, and slash prices. He would sell at a loss for months. His massive profits from Cleveland would subsidize the war in Pittsburgh. The local competitors would look at their balance sheets and bleed. They couldn't understand how Standard Oil could sell so cheap. They thought he would go bankrupt. But Rockefeller knew the math. He knew exactly how long he had to bleed to kill them. And once they were dead or bought out, the prices would go back up. This was the new phase of the war. It wasn't about secret railroad deals anymore, though they continued in subtler forms. It was about brute force capital and operational superiority. Rockefeller was building a juggernaut that could not be stopped by laws or boycotts. But a new threat was emerging, a technological innovation that threatened to make the railroads and Rockefeller's leverage over them obsolete. A long, metal snake was being built in the Pennsylvania hills, the first long-distance oil pipeline. If the oil could flow directly from the wells to the coast, bypassing the trains, Rockefeller's stranglehold on logistics would be broken. Rockefeller saw this threat, and his response would define the next chapter of his legacy. He wouldn't just fight the pipeline. He would try to do the impossible. He would try to buy the flow of nature itself. In the next part, we'll witness the pipeline wars. We'll see how Rockefeller faced a technology that threatened his existence, and how he ruthlessly pivoted to control it. We'll also explore the creation of the trust, the legal loophole that allowed him to rule his empire from the shadows, bypassing the laws of the United States. The monster is growing, and it's getting hungry for more. By the late 1870s, John D. Rockefeller seemed invincible. He had the refineries. He had the railroads in his pocket. But in business, your greatest threat often comes from where you least expect it. It doesn't come from a competitor playing your game better. It comes from someone changing the game entirely. That game changer was a long, iron tube snaking through the Allegheny Mountains. The independent oil producers in Pennsylvania, desperate to escape Rockefeller's railroad stranglehold, decided to do the impossible. They pooled their resources to build the Tidewater pipeline. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of putting oil in barrels, lifting barrels onto wagons, and loading wagons onto trains, why not just pump the oil directly from the ground to the ocean? It was the 19th century equivalent of the internet disrupting the postal service. If the pipeline worked, the railroads would become irrelevant. And if the railroads were irrelevant, Rockefeller's leverage would vanish. Most monopolists, when faced with disruption, try to kill it with the old tools. They lobby for laws to ban it. They use their existing power to crush it. Rockefeller did that too. He bought up strips of land right in the path of the pipeline to block construction. He sent armed men to intimidate the workers. He started a propaganda campaign claiming the pipeline would leak and destroy the environment. But here is the brilliance of the Rockefeller algorithm. He was not stubborn. He was fluid. He realized very quickly that the pipeline wasn't just a threat. It was the future. While he was fighting the Tidewater pipeline with one hand, he was quietly ordering his engineers to build a massive pipeline network of his own with the other. This is a critical lesson in survival. When a new technology threatens your business model, you have two choices: die fighting it, or adopt it faster and better than anyone else. Rockefeller chose the latter. He didn't just want to stop the Tidewater. He wanted to become the pipeline. The pipeline wars were brutal. It was a race against time and geography. The Tidewater engineers performed a miracle, pumping oil over the mountains in 1879. The oil flowed. The monopoly was technically broken. For a brief moment, the independent producers cheered. They thought they had won. But they underestimated the scale of Rockefeller's ambition. While they were celebrating their one pipeline, Rockefeller unleashed the full weight of his capital. He built 4 major pipelines simultaneously, connecting the oil fields to his refineries in Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia, and Buffalo. He didn't just build pipelines. He built a web. He saturated the region. And then he did what he always did. He used his superior capital to make the independents an offer they couldn't refuse. The Tidewater Pipeline, the symbol of resistance, was struggling financially. Building it had drained their resources. Rockefeller waited until they were weak, and then he made his move. He didn't buy them outright at first. That would have caused a public outcry. Instead, he quietly bought shares. He bought influence. He initiated a price war on pipeline fees that the Tidewater couldn't sustain. Eventually, the competitor was absorbed into the National Transit Company, a subsidiary of Standard Oil. By controlling the pipelines, Rockefeller achieved something even greater than controlling the railroads. He now owned the road itself. He controlled the flow of the commodity from the earth to the lamp. He had achieved total vertical integration. Every drop of oil, from the moment it left the ground to the moment it was burned in a home in London or Shanghai, passed through his hands. He didn't just tax the industry, he was the industry. But as his power grew, so did the legal headaches. In the 19th century, corporations were creatures of state law. A company chartered in Ohio, like Standard Oil, wasn't legally allowed to own property or stock in other companies in other states. This was a major problem. Rockefeller effectively owned refineries and pipelines across Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. But legally, he couldn't put them all under one roof. He had to rely on a messy system of trustees, partners who held assets in their own names. It was legally fragile. If a partner died or betrayed him, the empire could fracture. Furthermore, the public and politicians were waking up. State legislatures were passing laws specifically designed to contain giant corporations. Rockefeller was a man who hated chaos, and his legal structure was becoming chaotic. He needed a way to centralize control of his sprawling, multi-state empire without breaking the laws of Ohio. He needed a legal invention as potent as his business strategy. Enter Samuel C.T. Dodd, a brilliant, unassuming lawyer who would become the architect of the trust. Dodd looked at the problem and found a loophole in the ancient laws of equity. He proposed a radical idea. Why not separate the ownership of the assets from the control of the assets? In 1882, the Standard Oil Trust was formed. Here is how the algorithm worked. The shareholders of all the dozens of companies Rockefeller had acquired, the refineries, the pipelines, the barrel factories, would hand over their stock certificates to a board of 9 trustees, led by Rockefeller. In exchange, they received trust certificates. These certificates entitled them to a share of the profits, the dividends, but gave them absolutely no voting rights. All the voting power, all the control, was concentrated in the hands of the 9 trustees sitting in an office at 26 Broadway in New York City. This was legal alchemy. It allowed Rockefeller to rule a global empire as a single, unified entity, while legally pretending it was just a loose collection of companies. It bypassed the state laws that forbade cross-state ownership. It made the company nimble, secretive, and incredibly powerful. The trust was a machine designed for total efficiency. Rockefeller could now shut down an inefficient refinery in Pittsburgh and ramp up production in Brooklyn with a single command. He could coordinate prices globally. He could negotiate with railroads as a single block. This structure was so effective that soon other industries copied it. You had the sugar trust, the tobacco trust, the steel trust. Rockefeller had inadvertently invented the structure of modern corporate America, but in doing so, he gave his enemies a name. They weren't just fighting a company anymore. They were fighting the trusts. The word became synonymous with greed, tyranny, and the destruction of the American dream. By the mid-1880s, John D. Rockefeller was the most powerful private citizen on Earth. By 1900, John D. Rockefeller controlled the fuel of the world. He was retired, living in his estates, playing golf, and believing his legacy was secure. But he made a fatal miscalculation. He underestimated the power of the narrative. He thought that if his numbers were right, his reputation didn't matter. He lived by the maxim, never complain, never explain. Silence was his shield. But silence leaves a vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped a woman named Ida Minerva Tarbell. Ida wasn't just a journalist. She was a woman on a mission. She was a muckraker, a term coined by President Teddy Roosevelt to describe writers who dig through the dirt to expose corruption. But for Ida, this wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. She grew up in the oil fields of Pennsylvania. Her father was an independent oil producer, a man who built wooden barrels and drilled for black gold. She watched her father's business disintegrate. She watched him come home defeated, night after night, crushed by the Cleveland Massacre and the South Improvement Company conspiracy. She saw the suicide of her father's partner. She saw the devastation of her community. And she knew exactly who was responsible. John D. Rockefeller. Decades later, working for McClure's magazine, she decided to take him down. But she didn't do it with insults. She didn't do it with emotional rants. She did it with something Rockefeller respected above all else: data. She spent years digging through thousands of pages of court documents, transcripts, and congressional hearings. She found the lost contracts. She found the spies. she found the rebate records. She conducted the first true forensic investigation in business journalism history. She wasn't writing a hit piece. She was building a legal case in the court of public opinion. In November 1902, McClure's magazine published the first installment of the history of the Standard Oil Company. It wasn't a book released all at once. It was a serial, month after month, chapter after chapter. Ida Tarbell peeled back the layers of the Standard Oil onion. It was the Netflix series of the early 20th century. The public was addicted. They waited in line at newsstands to read the next chapter. Why? Because for the first time, someone was explaining how the game was rigged. Before Tarbell, people knew Rockefeller was rich and ruthless, but they didn't know the mechanics. Tarbell showed them the gears of the machine. She published the actual rebate numbers. She exposed the spy network. She showed how Standard Oil would bribe railroad clerks to get data on competitors' shipments. She painted a portrait of Rockefeller that was devastatingly effective. She described him not as a brilliant businessman, but as a living mummy, a man devoid of human emotion, a machine that consumed everything in its path. She attacked his moral character, contrasting his public piety and church-going with his private ruthlessness. She asked the question, how can a man claim to serve God while destroying his neighbors? Rockefeller's response: silence. He refused to read the articles. He told his associates to ignore that misguided woman. He thought that engaging with her would only give her credibility. It was the biggest strategic error of his life. His silence was interpreted as guilt. While he stayed quiet, Tarbell controlled the narrative. She defined him for a generation. The impact was seismic. Cartoons began to appear in newspapers across the country. The most famous one depicted Standard Oil as a giant octopus, its tentacles wrapped around the U.S. Capitol, the steel industry, the shipping lines, and the American worker. The eye of the octopus was the cold, staring face of John D. Rockefeller. He became the most hated man in America. People didn't just dislike him, they demonized him. He received death threats daily. He had to sleep with a revolver by his bed. When he went to church, people would stare. Mothers would threaten their children, "Be good, or Rockefeller will get you." This hatred spilled over into politics. Politicians realized that attacking the trusts, and specifically Standard Oil, was a guaranteed way to get votes. The sleeping giant of the U.S. government began to stir. The Department of Justice, armed with the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been dormant for years, began to look at Tarbell's research. She had essentially done the prosecutor's homework for them. This teaches us a crucial lesson about power. You can control the supply, you can control the price. But if you lose the social license to operate, if the public decides you are evil, no amount of money can save you. Rockefeller had won the economic war, but he was losing the political and social war. We often look at billionaires as impervious figures, but the stress of being the world's villain took a gruesome toll on Rockefeller's body. In the early 1900s, as the attacks intensified, Rockefeller's health collapsed. He developed a condition called alopecia totalis. He lost every hair on his body. His eyebrows, his eyelashes, his mustache, everything vanished. He looked like a ghost. He had to wear wigs for the rest of his life. His digestion failed him. The richest man in the world, who could afford any meal on earth, was reduced to eating only milk and crackers. He was plagued by insomnia. He would pace the hallways of his mansion at night, haunted by the hatred of millions. Psychosomatic illness is real. The mind attacks the body. Rockefeller was disintegrating. His doctors warned him, "John, you have a choice. You can have your money, or you can have your life. If you don't change, you will be dead in a year." He was in his 50s, looking like he was 80. He faced an existential crisis. He had spent his entire life accumulating. He had the algorithm for getting, but he had no algorithm for giving, no algorithm for peace. He realized that the strategy that built his empire was now killing him. It was in this moment of physical and reputational ruin that Rockefeller met a man who would save his soul and his legacy. His name was Frederick T. Gates. Gates was a Baptist minister, but he had the mind of a venture capitalist. He looked at Rockefeller's charity and saw chaos. Rockefeller was giving money away, but he was doing it poorly. He was giving small amounts to beggars, to random letters. It was inefficient. It was retail charity. Gates told him, "Mr. Rockefeller, your fortune is rolling up like an avalanche. You must keep up with it. You must distribute it faster than it grows. If you do not, it will crush you and your children and your children's children." Rockefeller listened. He recognized the language of efficiency. Gates proposed a new idea: wholesale philanthropy. Instead of giving $1 to a hungry man, why not build a university to study the root causes of poverty? Instead of curing one sick person, why not fund a laboratory to eradicate the disease entirely? This was the pivot. Rockefeller began to apply the same ruthless, calculated genius to giving money away that he had applied to making it. He didn't just want to be a donor. He wanted to be an investor in humanity. He started with the University of Chicago. He poured millions into it, demanding it be the best in the world. Then he turned his eyes to medicine. He asked Gates, "What is the business of medicine?" Gates replied that medicine in America was backward, unscientific, so Rockefeller decided to fix it. He created the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. This wasn't just charity. It was a strategic rebranding. Whether calculated or genuine, it began to shift the narrative. But was it enough? Could money buy back a reputation destroyed by Ida Tarbell? And meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a man named Theodore Roosevelt was sharpening his axe, ready to chop the Standard Oil octopus into pieces. In the next part, we'll witness the trial of the century. The United States government versus Standard Oil. we'll analyze the breakup, the irony of how it made Rockefeller even richer, and the birth of the modern foundation system that still rules the world today. By 1904, the battle lines were drawn. On one side stood John D. Rockefeller, the Emperor of Oil, a man who believed he was above the law, because he had essentially written the economic laws of the country. On the other side stood Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States. Roosevelt was a force of nature. He was loud, aggressive, and populist. He understood something Rockefeller did not. In a democracy, political power ultimately trumps economic power. If the people are angry enough, and thanks to Ida Tarbell, the people were furious. Roosevelt didn't hate capitalism. He hated the arrogance of the trusts. He famously said, "We draw the line against misconduct, not against wealth." He wanted to prove that the government, not Wall Street, ran America. He instructed his Justice Department to go after the biggest game in the jungle, Standard Oil. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a war for the soul of the American economy. The government appointed a ferocious prosecutor named Frank B. Kellogg. His job was to prove that Standard Oil wasn't just big, which wasn't illegal, but that it had maintained its size through illegal, predatory tactics. Rockefeller, now in his late 60s and officially retired, tried to stay out of the spotlight. He spent his time hiding from process servers at his estates, dodging subpoenas like a common fugitive. It was a humiliating spectacle for the world's richest man. Eventually, he had to testify. The courtroom drama was electric. Rockefeller took the stand. He looked frail, wearing a wig to hide his alopecia. He claimed he didn't remember details. He played the role of a forgetful old man. "I have no recollection," he would say, over and over again. It was a brilliant, frustrating performance. But the paper trail, the trail Ida Tarbell had uncovered, was too deep to ignore. The legal battle dragged on for years. It culminated in the Supreme Court case Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus United States. In May 1911, Chief Justice Edward White delivered the verdict. The court ruled unanimously against Standard Oil. They declared it an illegal monopoly that had unreasonably restrained trade. It validated everything the independent drillers and refiners had been saying for 40 years. The court ordered the unthinkable: the dissolution of Standard Oil. The giant monolith was to be broken into 34 separate, independent companies. They were given 6 months to untangle the web of ownership that Rockefeller and his lawyers had spent decades weaving. For the public, it was a victory day. The octopus had been slain. The monster was dead. Roosevelt beat his chest. The little guy had won, or so they thought. This moment teaches us a profound lesson about the difference between optics and economics. Rockefeller, with his supreme financial intellect, saw something else entirely. He saw a restructuring opportunity that would unlock value he couldn't access before. When the news of the breakup reached Rockefeller, he was playing golf with a priest. He read the telegram, put it in his pocket, and calmly said to the priest, "Father, have you any money?" The priest said no. Rockefeller advised him, "Buy Standard Oil." Why was he so calm? Because Rockefeller understood the stock market better than the Supreme Court did. Before 1911, Standard Oil was a private, secretive trust. Its true value was hidden. It didn't publish detailed financial reports. Wall Street knew it was rich, but they didn't know how rich. But when the court ordered the breakup, the black box had to be opened. Each of the 34 new companies had to issue its own stock. They had to open their books to the public. Investors suddenly saw the reality. They saw the pipelines, the refineries, the tank cars, the oil reserves, the cash piles. They realized that the sum of the parts was worth far, far more than the whole. This is the concept of unbundling. Sometimes, a conglomerate is so big that its individual units are undervalued. The 34 baby standards were born. You know their names today. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. Continental Oil became Conoco. These weren't small companies. They were instant giants. And who owned the stock in these new companies? The same people who owned the old Standard Oil? Rockefeller owned about 25% of the original trust. So, he received 25% of the stock in every single one of the 34 new companies. What happened next is the greatest irony in business history. As the new stocks began to trade, a frenzy ensued. The automobile age was just beginning. Henry Ford had launched the Model T in 1908. The world didn't need kerosene for lamps anymore. Electricity was taking over. But the world desperately needed gasoline for cars. Standard Oil, the monopoly built on kerosene, was perfectly positioned to fuel the car revolution. The demand for gasoline exploded right as the company was broken up. The stock prices of Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron soared. They doubled, then tripled, then quadrupled. Rockefeller, sitting in his retirement, watched his net worth skyrocket. Before the breakup, he was worth maybe $300 million. A few years after the breakup, his fortune had ballooned to nearly $1 billion. In 1910's currency, the government's punishment had made him the first certified billionaire in human history. He became richer than he had ever been in his wildest dreams. The Sherman Antitrust Act, designed to destroy his wealth, had multiplied it. This is the ultimate paradox of the Rockefeller algorithm. He built a machine so robust, so aligned with the fundamental needs of civilization, which is energy, that even destroying the machine only made the pieces more valuable. He had positioned himself on the right side of history and economics. No law could change the fact that the world needed oil, and he owned the oil. The breakup did achieve one thing. It introduced competition. The baby standards began to compete with each other. They fought for territory. They innovated. Marketing became important. Gas stations began to pop up on every corner of America. But let's be real. It was a polite competition. These companies were run by men who had worked together for decades. They shared the same DNA. They formed a global oligopoly that would dominate the 20th century, often called the Seven Sisters. Rockefeller was done with business. He had conquered the commercial world completely. He had won the game. But he still had one battle left to fight. The battle for his soul and his name. He was still the most hated man in America, despite his newfound billions. The blood money stigma wouldn't go away. He realized that to change his legacy, he had to apply his algorithm to the only thing left, giving it all away. He didn't want to just be remembered as the man who crushed the little guy. He wanted to be remembered as a benefactor of mankind. And just as he had crushed the oil market, he decided to crush the problems of disease, ignorance, and poverty. In the final part of our series, we'll look at the final pivot. We'll explore how Rockefeller invented modern philanthropy, how he eradicated hookworm, how he funded the Green Revolution, and how he built a soft power empire that still influences global health and policy today. We'll ask the final, difficult question. Can money wash away sin? And was John D. Rockefeller a hero or a villain? John D. Rockefeller retired from Standard Oil in 1897. He spent the last 40 years of his life, nearly half a century, focusing on a single problem: how to give away money effectively. Most people think charity is about the heart. For Rockefeller, it was about the brain. He despised emotional giving. He believed that giving money to a drunkard was a sin because it only enabled his addiction. He believed that charity, if done wrong, creates dependency. So, he invented scientific philanthropy. He applied the Standard Oil algorithm to the business of doing good. His first major target was the American South. At the turn of the 20th century, the South was economically backward. People were lethargic, pale, and weak. They were called lazy by the North. But Rockefeller's advisors told him something else. These people aren't lazy. They are sick. They are infected with a parasite called hookworm. Hookworm was a plague. It sucked the blood and energy out of millions of people. Rockefeller didn't just write a check. He created the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission. He hired doctors, scientists, and educators. They launched a massive military-style campaign. They mapped the infection zones. They went door to door. They educated people on hygiene, wear shoes, build outhouses. Within a few years, they had tested over 1 million people and treated hundreds of thousands. They effectively eradicated hookworm from the American South. This act alone unleashed the economic potential of an entire region. It was a staggering return on investment. Rockefeller had spent a few $1,000,000 to generate billions in future productivity. But just as Rockefeller was rebranding himself as a benevolent grandfather figure, the dark side of his empire reared its head one last time. In 1914, a strike broke out at the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, a mining operation owned by the Rockefeller family. The miners were living in feudal conditions. They lived in company towns, were paid in company scrip. The strike turned violent. The company hired armed guards and detective agencies to break the strike. On April 20th, 1914, a gun battle erupted. The National Guard was called in. They fired machine guns into the tent colony where the striking miners and their families were living. Then, they set the tents on fire. It is known as the Ludlow Massacre. 2 women and 11 children suffocated and burned to death in a pit beneath a tent. The nation was horrified. Rockefeller, now an old man, was once again called a murderer. He was hauled before Congress to testify. It forced Rockefeller's son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., to fundamentally change labor relations in America. Despite the Ludlow stain, the philanthropy machine kept rolling. In 1913, Rockefeller chartered the Rockefeller Foundation. Its mission was simple and terrifyingly broad: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. It funded the Green Revolution in the 1940s and 50s, led by Norman Borlaug, which developed high-yield crops that literally saved 1 billion people from starvation in India and Mexico. Think about that. The money extracted from the Pennsylvania oil fields ended up saving 1 billion lives in Asia. He funded the research that discovered DNA. He funded the social sciences. Critics argue that this was blood money used to buy immortality. And they are not entirely wrong. The foundation promoted American values, American science, and American capitalism. But Rockefeller didn't care about the critics. He believed that he was merely a steward of God's gold. In his final years, John D. Rockefeller became a caricature of himself. He was obsessed with living to 100. He gave away shiny new dimes to everyone he met. Adults, children, even fellow millionaires like Harvey Firestone. The man who had crushed industries with one hand was handing out 10-cent coins with the other. On May 23rd, 1937, John D. Rockefeller died in his sleep at his home in Florida. He was 97 years old. He missed his goal of 100 by less than 3 years. So, here we are at the end of the journey. We have dissected the life of the Titan. How do we judge John D. Rockefeller? Was he a villain? Yes. Was he a hero? In a strange, utilitarian way. Yes. The truth is, he was neither, and he was both. He was a force of nature. Rockefeller is gone, but his algorithm remains. Look around you. Look at Amazon. Look at Google. Jeff Bezos is the modern Rockefeller of retail. Bill Gates is the modern Rockefeller of software and philanthropy. They are walking on the road that John D. Rockefeller paved. The lesson of Rockefeller isn't just about history. It is about the present. It teaches us that power hates a vacuum. It teaches us that efficiency is a double-edged sword. And it teaches us that in the game of titans, morality is often just another variable in the ledger. He proved that one man, armed with a ledger and a vision, could grab the world by the throat and force it to change. The question he leaves us with is this: if you had that kind of power, if you had the ability to shape the world, but you had to break a few rules, and a few people to do it, would you? This has been the Titans Algorithm. Thank you for watching. If this story opened your eyes, please subscribe and hit the bell icon. We are building a community of critical thinkers